They called him worthless before the dust had even settled on his boots, and by sundown, not a single soul in town would dare say it again. The sun hung low over Dry Creek, bleeding gold across the wooden storefronts and the dry, cracked road that cut through the middle of it like an old scar, and Elias Boone stood at the edge of that road with the stillness of a man who had nowhere left to go but forward. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, boots caked in a week's worth of trail dust, hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, and yet there was something in the way he held himself that didn't match the name they were already giving him. Drifter. Worthless. The words passed between men leaning on railings, women behind half-open windows, a pair of ranch hands standing near the hitching post with cheap laughter that carried farther than it should have. Elias didn't look at them. He looked at the saloon. The swinging doors creaked in the dry wind, and from inside came the faint clink of glass, the low murmur of voices, the kind of place where a man could buy a drink, or at least a moment of being treated like he existed. He stepped forward, slow, measured, boots pressing into dust that hadn't seen rain in weeks, and when he pushed those doors open, the room shifted just enough for him to feel it. Not silence. Not yet. Just a pause. The bartender, a thick-armed man with a towel draped over his shoulder, glanced up and held his gaze a second too long before turning away like he'd already made a decision. Elias approached the counter, his fingers brushing the worn wood, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, the kind that didn't beg and didn't demand. "Water," he said. That was all. No story. No explanation. Just one word, dry as the land outside. The bartender didn't move. A man at the far end of the bar let out a quiet chuckle, then another joined in, and soon it spread, not loud, not cruel in the way men might admit to, but sharp enough to cut all the same. "We don't serve drifters who got nothing to pay," someone muttered, not even bothering to look at him. Elias reached into his coat, slow enough not to startle anyone, and pulled out a coin, setting it gently on the counter. It made a soft sound, barely louder than the wind outside, but the bartender still didn't pick it up. Instead, he grabbed a clean glass, filled it halfway from the barrel behind him, and for a brief second, it seemed like the moment might pass without incident. Then Harold Whitaker's voice came from the corner, smooth and certain, the kind of voice men listened to without thinking. "Pour it out," he said. No anger, just authority. The bartender hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then tipped the glass over the edge of the counter. Water hit the floorboards and disappeared into the dust between them like it had never been there at all. The coin stayed where Elias had placed it. No one laughed this time. They just watched. Elias looked down at the spreading dark stain on the wood, then at the empty glass still held in the bartender's hand, and for a long moment, he didn't move. The room waited for something. Anger, maybe, or shame, something loud enough to justify what they'd just done. But Elias Boone simply reached out, took the empty glass, and set it upright on the counter as if it still held something worth keeping. Then he turned, slow and quiet, and walked back toward the door, the sound of his boots softer now, almost swallowed by the weight of what the town had chosen to be. The door swung shut behind him with a dry creak that lingered longer than it should have, and outside, the light felt harsher, like the town itself had pushed him back into the sun on purpose, and Elias Boone paused on the wooden steps without turning around, as if listening to something only he could hear, the faint echo of laughter, the scrape of boots, the quiet agreement of people choosing distance over decency. And then he stepped down into the dust again, slow, steady, the same measured pace that had carried him across miles of empty land without complaint, without witness, and now carried him past eyes that followed but pretended not to. A wagon rattled by on the far side of the street, its driver glancing once before fixing his gaze ahead, and a woman sweeping her porch slowed just enough to watch Elias pass, her broom hovering midair like she had forgotten what it was for, then resuming only after he moved beyond her line of sight, as if motion alone could erase the discomfort of seeing a man treated like less than nothing. Elias stopped near the hitching post where a single horse stood tied, its ribs faintly visible beneath a dull coat, and he rested a hand on the animal's neck, not for comfort, not for show, just a brief moment of contact that seemed to settle something unseen, the horse shifting slightly under his touch, exhaling a quiet breath that carried the scent of leather and sun-warmed dust. Across the street, Harold Whitaker stepped out onto the saloon porch, his presence drawing attention without effort. The kind of man who did not raise his voice because he did not need to, and he leaned against the railing with a casual certainty, watching Elias the way one might watch a stray dog wander too close to a place it did not belong. "You heard what I said in there," Whitaker called out, his tone light, almost friendly, which made it worse. "This town has no use for men who bring nothing with them." A few heads nodded, subtle, practiced, the kind of agreement that required no words, and Elias did not answer, did not look up, his hand still resting on the horse, as if the conversation were happening somewhere far away. Whitaker smiled slightly, the expression never reaching his eyes, and added, "Best keep moving before folks start thinking you plan to stay." The words hung in the air, not a threat, not quite, but close enough that no one mistook the meaning. Elias finally lifted his gaze, not toward Whitaker, but toward the far end of the street where the road stretched out past the last building and into open land again. And for a moment, it seemed like he might do exactly that, turn and walk, let the town shrink behind him the way so many others had. But instead, he stepped away from the horse and moved toward the water trough near the general store, its wooden edges worn smooth by years of use, the surface inside reflecting the sky in a dull, broken shimmer. He knelt slightly, cupping his hand as if to gather what little he could, and before his fingers touched the water, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "That is not for you." The storekeeper stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his stance firm in a way that suggested borrowed courage, and he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "You heard Mr. Whitaker." Elias held his position for a second longer, his hand hovering just above the surface, close enough to feel the coolness rising from it. And then he lowered it, not into the water, but back to his side, straightening without a word. The trough remained untouched, the reflection unbroken, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet weight settling over the street as more people watched, as more people chose to say nothing, and Elias Boone stood there in the middle of it, not arguing, not pleading, simply existing in a place that had decided that was already too much. The town did not move on. It tightened, like a rope slowly pulled from all sides, and Elias could feel it without anyone needing to say a word. The way conversations shifted just enough when he passed, the way boots turned slightly to block space that had been open a moment before, the way doors stayed half closed, as if ready to shut completely if he came any closer, and still, he did not rush, did not lower his head. He simply walked, step by step, down the length of Dry Creek, as if the road belonged to him just as much as anyone else standing there pretending it did not. A boy, no older than 10, stood near the edge of the boardwalk holding a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, his small hands unsure, his eyes fixed on Elias with something that had not yet learned to hide itself. And for a second, the world seemed to hold its breath again, because kindness, even a small one, always arrives quietly before it is noticed, and the boy took a step forward, just one, lifting the bread slightly, as if offering it without words. "Do not." His mother's voice cut in sharp and low, her hand reaching out to pull him back before the distance could close, her fingers gripping his shoulder tight enough to stop him where he stood, and she did not look at Elias when she spoke. "Again, we do not give to men like that." The boy hesitated, confusion flickering across his face, then lowered the bread slowly, the moment folding in on itself like it had never existed, and Elias saw it. Not the bread, not the gesture, but the hesitation, the place where something good had almost happened and was turned away before it could take shape. He kept walking. Harold Whitaker stepped down from the saloon porch now, boots hitting the dust with quiet authority, and he moved into the street, as if placing himself directly in Elias's path, without making it obvious. The kind of movement that looked casual until you realized it left no room to pass without acknowledgement. "You are still here," Whitaker said, tilting his head slightly, the hint of a smile returning as if this were all part of a conversation he was enjoying. "I figured a man with sense would have taken the road by now." Elias stopped a few feet away, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to ignore him, and for the first time since he entered the town, he lifted his eyes fully, meeting Whitaker's gaze without challenge, without submission, just presence, steady and unshaken. The silence stretched, thin but strong, and it unsettled more than any argument could have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to twist into something easier to dismiss. Whitaker shifted his weight slightly, the smallest sign that something was not landing the way he expected, and behind him, a few men watched closer now, their earlier confidence quieting into something less certain, though none of them would have named it. "You do not belong here," Whitaker added, softer this time, as if stating a fact rather than making a point. Elias's gaze did not change. He said nothing. The wind moved through the street, carrying dust in slow spirals that caught the light, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of hooves echoed, too far to matter yet, too distant to draw attention, but present all the same, like something approaching that no one had accounted for. Whitaker let out a small breath, almost a laugh, and stepped aside at last, not as a concession, not as permission, but because standing there had stopped feeling like control and started feeling like something else entirely, something he did not understand. Elias walked past him without a word, the space opening just enough to let him through, and as he moved on, the town watched again, not with laughter this time, not even with open contempt, but with a quieter, heavier attention, as if something had shifted beneath the surface and no one could quite see where it would break through. The sound of hooves grew clearer now, not loud, not urgent, but steady, deliberate, the kind of rhythm that carried weight without needing speed, and Elias heard it before anyone else seemed willing to acknowledge it. His steps slowing just slightly as he reached the far end of the street where the buildings thinned and the open land began to stretch out again, a place where a man could disappear without anyone asking where he went or why. Behind him, Dry Creek shifted once more, heads turning not toward Elias this time, but toward the road leading in, eyes narrowing against the sun as a single rider came into view, outlined in light and dust, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to prove he belonged. The horse was dark, well kept, its gait smooth and controlled, and the man in the saddle sat straight, his hat casting a long shadow over his face, badge catching a brief glint of sunlight before settling back into stillness. Sheriff Thomas Hale did not hurry. He never did. He rode into town the way the day arrived, certain, expected, and impossible to ignore once it was there. Conversations faded without being told to, movement slowed, and even Harold Whitaker, still standing near the center of the street, shifted his posture just enough to acknowledge the change, his easy confidence tightening into something more measured, more careful. Elias did not turn immediately. He stood with his back half-angled to the town, gaze still set on the horizon ahead, as if weighing something no one else could see, and for a moment, it seemed like the rider might pass through without stopping, just another arrival in a place that had already made up its mind about the man standing at its edge. But the horse slowed, not by command spoken aloud, but by something quieter, a subtle shift in the reins, a recognition that did not yet have words. Sheriff Hale's eyes moved across the street, taking in the faces, the stillness, the absence of sound where there should have been at least a greeting, and then they settled, not on Whitaker, not on the saloon, but on Elias Boone. It was not a long look. It did not need to be. Something in it held longer than it should have, a pause that did not belong to routine, and a few people noticed, though none of them understood why. Whitaker stepped forward again, quicker this time, reclaiming space before it could shift too far from his control, and he tipped his hat slightly in greeting, his voice smooth, practiced. "Sheriff, just a quiet day. Nothing worth your concern." Hill did not answer right away. He brought his horse to a full stop, the animal's breath steady, its ears flicking once as if sensing the tension that hung just beneath the surface of the street, and the sheriff's gaze remained where it had settled, fixed on the man at the edge of town who had not asked for anything except a drink of water and had been denied even that. Elias finally turned then, slow, deliberate, meeting the look without hesitation, and for the briefest second, something passed between them, not recognition in the way others might see it, not yet, but a question, quiet and unspoken, carried in the space between two men who stood very differently in the eyes of the town, but not, perhaps, in the truth of who they were. The wind moved again, lifting dust in thin lines across the ground, and the silence deepened, stretching wider than the street itself, because now it was no longer just about a drifter or a town or a man who thought he owned both. Now it held something else entirely, something waiting to be seen, and Sheriff Hale did not look away. The air held its breath in a way that made even the smallest movement feel louder than it should have, and Sheriff Hale remained still in the saddle, his gaze steady, not sharp, not accusing, just fixed with a quiet attention that unsettled more than any raised voice ever could. And Elias Boone did not look away, did not shift his stance, did not reach for anything to explain himself. He simply stood as he had since the moment he arrived, grounded in something no one else in Dry Creek seemed able to name. Whitaker cleared his throat lightly, the sound too controlled to be natural, and took another step closer to the sheriff, placing himself just within the edge of Hale's view, careful not to block it entirely. "Just passing through, I imagine," he said, nodding toward Elias with a faint smile that suggested the matter was already settled. "Man came in, asked for more than he had a right to, and now he is on his way out." Hale's eyes did not follow the gesture. They stayed where they were, studying Elias in a way that made time stretch thin, and then, slowly, almost absently, the sheriff shifted his posture in the saddle, leaning forward just enough to see more clearly, not the man's face alone, but the details others had overlooked, the way Elias stood with his weight balanced evenly, not favoring one side, the way his shoulders remained relaxed despite the tension around him, the way his hands rested open and still at his sides, not clenched, not defensive, simply ready. A faint line appeared between Hale's brows, not confusion, not yet, but recognition trying to find its shape. "You been here long?" Hale asked at last, his voice calm, even, carrying across the street without force. Elias answered without hesitation, his tone matching the sheriff's, quiet, direct, "Long enough." It was not the kind of answer that satisfied most men, but Hale did not press, not immediately. Instead, his gaze dropped, just briefly, tracing the line of Elias's coat, the worn fabric, the dust, the signs of distance traveled, and then lower still, to his hands, where the sunlight caught something small near the edge of his sleeve, a faint mark, barely visible, the outline of an old scar that curved along the wrist in a way that spoke of something precise, something not accidental. Hale's eyes lingered there a fraction longer than they should have, and Whitaker noticed it, though he did not understand it, shifting slightly again, his confidence thinning at the edges. "Like I said," Whitaker added, a touch quicker now, "nothing for you to concern yourself with, Sheriff. We handle our own here." The words settled poorly in the air, heavier than intended, and Hale finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge him, though his eyes did not fully leave Elias. "Do you?" he said simply, not agreeing, not challenging, just placing the statement back where it came from. The horse beneath him shifted its weight, hooves pressing softly into the dirt, and Hale reached down to steady the reins, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if giving himself time to think without making it obvious. Across the street, the boy still held the piece of bread, forgotten now in his hands, his eyes moving between the sheriff and the man no one had allowed to drink, and the silence deepened again, no longer uncertain, but expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks, though the sky above remained clear and wide. Elias stood where he was, the same as before, but something had changed in the space around him, something subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift that happens when one man sees what others refuse to, and does not turn away from it. Hale's fingers tightened slightly on the reins, then relaxed, and he drew in a slow breath that carried the scent of dust, leather, and something older, something remembered, and when he looked back at Elias fully this time, there was no hesitation left in his gaze, only a quiet certainty forming beneath it, still unspoken, but already reshaping the weight of everything that had happened since the moment that first glass of water had been poured into the dirt. The stillness did not break, it deepened, settling over Dry Creek like a shadow that had no source, and Sheriff Hale slowly swung one leg over the saddle, boots touching the ground with a soft, deliberate weight that seemed to echo louder than it should have, and no one spoke as he let the reins fall loose in his hand and took a single step forward, then another, closing the distance between himself and Elias Boone without hurry, without hesitation, as if each step had already been decided long before this moment arrived. Whitaker watched closely now, the faint smile gone from his face, replaced by something tighter, something uncertain, and he shifted again, just enough to place himself near the sheriff's path, though not directly in it. Careful, calculating, Sheriff, he said, his voice lower this time, controlled but no longer easy. You do not need to concern yourself with a stranger who does not belong here. Hale did not answer him. He did not even look at him. His attention remained fixed ahead, on Elias, on the quiet figure standing at the edge of a town that had already judged him without knowing anything worth judging. And as Hale drew closer, the details became clearer: the dust on the coat, the worn edges of the hat, the faint lines of travel etched into every part of him. And beneath it all, something else, something that did not belong to a man who drifted without purpose. Hale stopped a few feet away, close enough now to see the small things others had missed. The way Elias's breathing remained steady despite the weight of every eye in town pressing against him. The way his gaze held without challenge, without apology, and again, Hale's eyes dropped, just slightly, to that same place near the wrist, the faint scar catching the light. And this time, recognition settled deeper, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. Where did you come from? Hale asked, his voice quieter now, not for the town, not for Whitaker, but for the man standing in front of him. Elias did not hesitate. Far enough, he said, the same calm, the same restraint, and Hale gave a small nod, as if that answer meant more than it should have, as if distance was not measured in miles alone. The wind shifted again, carrying the dry scent of the land through the street, brushing past them both, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the town had faded just slightly, like the edges of something narrowing to focus on a single point. Hale's gaze lifted once more, meeting Elias fully now, and there was something different in it, something that had not been there when he first rode in, not authority, not suspicion, but memory, quiet and heavy, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece until it can no longer be ignored. Whitaker took a step forward then, unable to remain still any longer, the balance of the moment slipping beyond his control. Sheriff, I said he. Hale raised a hand, not sharply, not forcefully, just enough to stop the words before they finished, and the gesture alone was enough, simple, final, leaving no room for interruption. Silence returned again, thicker now, filled with something that had weight, and Hale's hand lowered slowly back to his side as he studied Elias one last time, as if confirming what he already knew but had to see with his own eyes. Then, without a word, without any sign of announcement, Sheriff Thomas Hale reached up toward the brim of his hat, his fingers brushing against it lightly, not yet removing it, just resting there for a moment, as if feeling the shape of something that was about to change everything the town believed it understood. Time slowed in a way that no one in Dry Creek could explain, as if the dust itself hesitated to fall, and Sheriff Hale's fingers rested against the brim of his hat for one long breath before they moved. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady, certain, lifting the hat from his head with a quiet motion that carried more weight than any command he could have spoken. The sunlight caught the crown of it as it rose, casting a brief shadow across his face before revealing it fully, and then he lowered it to his side, not as a gesture of fatigue, not as habit, but as something deliberate, something chosen. No one spoke. Not Whitaker, not the men by the saloon, not the woman on the porch, not even the boy who still held the piece of bread as if he had forgotten how to let it go. Because in a town like this, a sheriff did not remove his hat for just anyone. It meant respect. It meant recognition. It meant something had just shifted in a way no one had prepared for. Hale stood there, hat in hand, facing Elias Boone as if the rest of the town no longer existed, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering, and for a moment, it was not a sheriff and a drifter standing in the street, but two men meeting on equal ground, something the people watching had never considered possible. Whitaker's breath caught, subtle but real, his confidence faltering for the first time since the moment Elias stepped into town, and he glanced around as if looking for someone else to correct what he was seeing. But no one moved, no one stepped forward, because they were all seeing the same thing and none of them understood it. Elias did not react the way they expected either. He did not straighten with pride, did not speak, did not reach for anything to explain or claim what was being offered. He simply stood as he had from the beginning, calm, still, his eyes meeting Hale's without change, as if respect was not something new to him, only something others had forgotten to give. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint creak of wood and the distant rustle of open land beyond the town. And in that quiet space, Hale inclined his head just slightly, a motion so small it could have been missed if anyone had dared to blink. It was not a bow. It was not submission. It was acknowledgement. And that was enough to unravel everything the town believed it knew. A murmur tried to rise somewhere behind Whitaker, then died before it could form into words, because there was nothing to hold on to, no explanation offered, no accusation made, just a single act that spoke louder than anything they had said all morning. Whitaker's jaw tightened, his hands curling briefly at his sides before he forced them still again. And when he spoke, his voice lacked the ease it had carried before. "Sheriff, what is this?" he asked, the question sharper than he intended, edged with something that sounded too close to uncertainty. Hill did not look at him. He did not answer. He remained where he stood, hat at his side, eyes on Elias, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with meaning that did not need to be explained, because in that single gesture, the sheriff had already said everything that mattered, and the town, for the first time since Elias Boone had walked into it, no longer knew who was standing above whom. The silence did not break. It settled deeper, pressing into every corner of Dry Creek until even the smallest movement felt out of place, and Sheriff Hale remained, standing with his hat lowered at his side, his gaze steady on Elias Boone, as if the truth had already been decided long before anyone else realized there was something to uncover. A long moment passed before Hale finally spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying across the street without force, yet reaching every ear as if it had been placed there carefully. "You carried them out," he said, not as a question, not even as a statement meant to convince others, but as something remembered, something lived, one by one, when the canyon flooded. The words landed softly, but their weight spread outward, touching every face that had watched Elias with dismissal just moments before, and confusion followed close behind, because none of them had been there. None of them had seen what the sheriff was now recalling with quiet certainty. Elias did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted just slightly, not away, but inward, as if the memory Hale had spoken of was something he had never intended to bring back into the light. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained the same as it had been all along, steady, unembellished. Someone had to stay. That was all. No explanation, no claim, just a simple truth placed between them. Hale gave a small nod, as if that was exactly the answer he expected, and for the first time, he turned his head just enough to let his voice carry beyond Elias, toward the rest of the town. 3 days, Hale continued, still calm, still measured. 3 days of rain, and when the water came down through Red Canyon, it took everything with it. Wagons, horses, men who thought they could outrun it. His eyes moved briefly across the faces now watching him, not accusing, not judging, simply letting them hear what they had never known. "Most of us did run," he added, quieter now. "Most of us got clear and never looked back." The words hung there, not heavy with guilt, but with honesty, and then his gaze returned to Elias. He did not. The shift was almost invisible, but it was there, the moment when understanding began to replace assumption, when the shape of the man they had dismissed started to change into something none of them had prepared for. Hale lifted his hat slightly, not placing it back on his head, just holding it with both hands now, a gesture that felt closer to reverence than authority. "You buried the dead," he said, his voice softer still, when no one else stayed to do it. A faint breath moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, just the sound of something breaking open inside people who had already decided what kind of man Elias Boone was. Whitaker stood frozen, the certainty that had carried him through the day slipping away piece by piece. And for the first time, he did not step forward, did not speak, because there was nothing left that would hold against what had just been said. Elias lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame, not in pride, but in quiet acceptance, as if the memory belonged to the past and did not need to be carried into the present any longer than necessary. "It was a long time ago," he said, almost to himself, and Hale shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "Not long enough," he replied. The wind passed through the street again, softer now, carrying dust that no longer felt as sharp, and the town stood there in the weight of what they had just heard, realizing without being told that the man they had denied water to was the same man who had once given everything he had to people who would never know his name. And in that realization, something shifted that no words could fully capture, something that did not need to be said out loud, because it was already written in the silence that followed. No one moved for a long time after the sheriff's words settled into the dust, and Dry Creek, a town that had always been quick to judge and quicker to speak, found itself without anything left to say, the weight of what had just been revealed pressing into every doorway, every window, every pair of eyes that had watched a man be turned away for something as simple as a drink of water. Elias Boone stood where he was, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if none of it had shifted anything inside him at all, and perhaps it had not, because men like him did not measure themselves by what others chose to see or ignore. Sheriff Hale slowly lifted his hat again, not placing it back on his head just yet, but holding it a moment longer as if marking the end of something that had needed to be said, and then, with quiet finality, he set it back in place, the gesture closing the space between past and present without another word. Across the street, the boy stepped forward again, hesitant at first, then with more certainty, the piece of bread still in his hands, no longer held back by a voice that now seemed smaller than it had before, and this time, no one stopped him. He crossed the distance carefully, each step carrying more courage than the last, until he stood a few feet from Elias, looking up not with fear, but with something clearer, something honest. He held the bread out without speaking. Elias looked down at it, then at the boy, and for the first time since he had entered the town, something in his expression shifted, not a smile, not quite, but a softening, a recognition of something that had almost been lost and had found its way back. He reached out, took the bread gently, and gave a small nod, no more than that, but it carried enough meaning to settle the moment in a way nothing else could. The boy stepped back, his task done, and the town watched, not with laughter, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding that came too late to undo what had already been done. Harold Whitaker remained where he stood, his authority stripped of its certainty, his words left unspoken because there was nothing he could say that would return things to the way they had been, and for once, he did not try. Elias turned then, not toward the saloon, not toward the people who had denied him, but toward the open road beyond the last building, the same road that had brought him here and would carry him away again without promise, without expectation. He broke the bread in half as he walked, keeping one piece, placing the other on the edge of the water trough he had been refused, leaving it there without explanation, a quiet act that lingered longer than anything spoken that day. Sheriff Hale watched him go, his gaze steady, respectful, but he did not follow, did not call out, because some men were not meant to be stopped, only remembered. The wind moved through Dry Creek once more, softer now, carrying dust that settled slowly instead of rising, and one by one, the people of the town returned to their places, though nothing felt quite the same as before, because somewhere between a spilled glass of water and a hat lifted in silence, they had been shown something they could not unsee, something that would stay with them long after Elias Boone had disappeared beyond the horizon. A reminder that out here, respect was not given by appearances,